Hi Bio20 students, hope things are going well for you guys. Almost at spring break now. I'm sure you guys are getting really excited. Please keep working hard until the midterm exam, which is on April 14th. As you know, midterm exams count for a lot, so it's really important that you do well on it. This review recording will help you do well on it, so please watch it really carefully and practice all the questions that are on it. If you continue to do that, you should do really well on the midterm. So let's just start off here with this cartoon. It says here, Professor Herman stopped when he heard that unmistakable thud. Another brain had imploded. So hope your brains don't implode during midterm week, but I know it is hard work, but keep it up. I was going to say we're almost at the end of the year. We're getting close. We're kind of at the final push of the year. So again, keep it up. We're going to talk at this point about communities, populations, and ecosystems. And these three concepts, especially communities and populations, are fairly related. So let's see how these concepts are related and how they're different. So what's a population? This is a group of the same species of organism living in one area. So if you had a group of lions known as a pride, for instance, living in one area, that's a population of lions. A community, on the other hand, is a group of many different species living in one area. So even though they might be related, for instance, ducks and geese, because they're different species, they're going to be different, and together they make up a community. Now, an ecosystem is an environment where both living things and non-living things interact together. And remember, the word biotic is the word that stands for living things, and abiotic stands for non-living things. So things like rocks and trees would be non-living things, or abiotic. So moving on to the next page, an ecosystem can be very large, and it can also be quite small. A pond is an example of an ecosystem, but even something like a little puddle could possibly be seen as an ecosystem. Now, the word ecology is kind of related to ecosystems. Ecology is the study of ecosystems and the living and non-living things that are in them. But when we talk about the whole region of the Earth, which includes the water, land, and sky, that whole region where living things are found, this is known as the biosphere. Okay, so we're going to look at each of these terms here. We're going to come up with definitions for them. And again, these blue words are words that you want to keep practicing until you know them. So the first one, population, well, that's a group of similar organisms in an area. A community is a group of different organisms in an area. An ecosystem is the living and non-living things that interact together in an area. Ecology is the study of ecosystems and the living and non-living things that make them up. And finally, biosphere, that's the whole region on Earth where living things are found. Okay, we're going to look at autotrophs and heterotrophs. Now, what does that mean? The word troph means to grow, and we know that green plants are the only organisms that make their own foods. Well, that's not quite true, because blue-green algae can as well. But for the most part, green plants are the only things. So a creature that can make its own food is called an autotroph, and the auto part of it kind of suggests that it happens on its own. Happens automatically, you could say. So green plants make their food through the process of photosynthesis, and that's where they take light energy from the sun and change it into chemical energy. Now, that chemical energy is stored in glucose, which is a special form of sugar. Okay, so plants are autotrophs, animals are heterotrophs, because unlike plants, they can't make their own food. Now, instead, they get their food and their energy from molecules like glucose and protein molecules. Okay, so another word for plants is producers, and that makes sense because they can produce their own food. On the other hand, animals are consumers because they consume other creatures for their food. So putting these things together, you could say that plants are autotrophs, and they're also producers, whereas animals are heterotrophs and also consumers. Okay, so producers, consumers, and decomposers are the main types of living things in an ecosystem. And some examples of decomposers are things like bacteria and worms. So as you know, if you put a bunch of food in a compost pile, things like bacteria and worms are going to break it down. So you can see in this picture here of a food chain, you can see that producers are the type of organism that gets the energy from the sun, so it kind of first introduces energy into the food chain, and then you have consumers, different levels of consumers, and decomposers break everything down. Okay, so a few more questions here in blue for you to practice later on. Write a sentence to use the words below to put the concepts together. So we want to put these three concepts together in a sentence. Same thing with B. And so for question A, we can say that green plants are producers because they produce their own food and are also known as autotrophs, and I put in brackets autotroph equals self-growing. Part B, we're putting the three words together again. So animals are consumers which eat or consume other creatures to live. Because they can't make their own food, they're known as heterotrophs. Okay, so we've talked about different abiotic parts of an ecosystem, non-living, so things like water or rocks. And in this situation, we're going to talk about soil. So we know that when rocks just going on to the next question here. Where does soil come from and what are the different types of soil? So we know that plants and animals decompose, and this is what produces soil. And also when rocks and minerals are broken down, that also produces soil. So we've also got two different words that are kind of related that have to do with plants when they decompose, producing different kinds of soil. So when land plants decompose, it forms humus, and when water plants decompose, it forms peat. And both of those are types of organic matter, very rich kind of soil, good for growing things. Okay, so there's different kinds of soil, and different types of plants enjoy growing on different types of soil, such as clay soil, sandy soil, and loam soil. Now, loam soil is kind of a combination of different types of soil. It's formed by organic matter, which again is decomposed once living things, as well as subsoil. So those two things, organic matter and subsoil, produce loam soil. Okay, so talking about subsoil, remember that it's made of three different things: gravel, sand, and clay. Okay, so in the soil, we have the topsoil at the top, which is high in organic matter, again, decomposed things. And you can see here that it's very high in nutrients. The subsoil, again, we said it was made of gravel, sand, and clay, and so it's low in organic matter. And it's also low in nutrients. Okay, now, we've already seen that soils can differ from one another, and some of the ways they can differ, one of them is based on how much space is between the particles. For instance, the clay soil has very little space between the particles. And a sandy soil, on the other hand, has a lot of space between the particles. And because of that, water can drain through that sandy soil very well. Now, another thing other than the space between the particles is how acidic a soil is. And so alkaline or basic soils have a high pH, acidic soils have a low pH, but remember that alkaline and basic, alkalinity and acidity are both kind of this, you could say, like two sides of the same coin. They both have to do with the measure of the pH of a soil. Okay, you can't see this too well. This is just showing the difference between a sandy soil that has large spaces between the particles and a clay soil that has very small spaces. Okay, so a little review about soil. What are two parts that make up a loam soil? That's the organic matter and subsoil. Question 8, what are three parts that make up the subsoil? Gravel, sand, and clay. Question 9, what are two important things that make soils different? And we saw that one is the amount of space between particles, and the other is acidity or alkalinity, if I can get that word. Question 10 says, tell the difference between humus and peat. So humus is the remains of land plants, whereas peat is the remains of water plants. Okay, we're going to talk about two really important processes for living things. One is photosynthesis, and the other is cellular respiration. And we're going to see how they are actually opposites. So I know you might not be able to see this diagram that well. When I send out the whiteboard PDF file, you should be able to see it better. But it's basically showing how photosynthesis, which is this process, so it goes from these things reacting together to produce these things. You can see it's the opposite, because cellular respiration takes the things that are produced by photosynthesis, oxygen and glucose, and uses to produce carbon dioxide and water. Okay, so again, photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide and water and uses them to produce oxygen and glucose. So we know that, right? We know that green plants that do photosynthesis, we know that they produce oxygen. That's one of their main roles in the atmosphere. When people talk about concerns over cutting down rainforests, that's partly because of the concern that there's going to be less oxygen. And of course, plants also produce glucose, right? They produce sugars. And so cellular respiration does the opposite. It takes those two things, the oxygen and the glucose, and it uses them to produce carbon dioxide and water. So remember that cellular respiration produces carbon dioxide. We're going to see later on that some other processes, both natural and man-made, also produce carbon dioxide. So it's probably the main form that carbon is found in the atmosphere. So when you think about cellular respiration, it's kind of like the way that your car burns fuel for energy. So in the same way, cellular respiration is using glucose to produce energy, and that's inside our cells. So chemical energy is being used to produce heat energy. Okay? Glucose is a form of chemical energy, and when we burn it in our cells, it produces the heat energy we need to live, to move around and do all those things. Okay, so question 11, what important things are used up and produced in each process? Okay, well, we know that in cellular respiration it's going to produce energy, right? We said that it's kind of like burning fuel, burning glucose as the fuel. So glucose is used up, energy is produced. Okay, how about photosynthesis? What does it use up and what does it produce? Well, we know that it produces glucose, among other things. We could also say it produces oxygen, right? What does it use up? Water and carbon dioxide. All right, now we looked at a few different chemical cycles and saw how chemicals such as carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus are cycled in the land, water, and sky. So let's look at some of these important cycles. One of them is the carbon cycle. So we've got a diagram here. Now we already know that carbon dioxide is used up in photosynthesis to produce glucose, which has this formula here. So you can see how the C, or carbon, from carbon dioxide is eventually used and becomes part of glucose. Okay, so cellular respiration then burns this glucose to again produce carbon dioxide. So that's one way carbon dioxide is produced in our atmosphere. Just all the plants and animals that are on Earth are producing carbon dioxide through cellular respiration. But some of the artificial means of producing carbon dioxide are cars, burning fuels, and industries as well. But all of this carbon dioxide, as you know, there's a lot of concern nowadays because of the idea that excess carbon dioxide could lead to the greenhouse effect, which eventually could lead to global warming. So again, carbon dioxide is thought to be like a giant shield around the Earth that traps heat inside the Earth and inside Earth's atmosphere, which again would cause global warming over the long term. Again, there's some debate between people as to what extent this is taking place. Some people say that temperatures have been going up and down over the long term, so they're saying that global warming isn't necessarily because of man-made carbon dioxide, such as from fuels, and so that's a matter of debate. Okay, so going on to the next cycle, the nitrogen cycle. Now we know that plants can't actually use nitrogen gas, which is floating around as N2 gas in the atmosphere. Only nitrogen-fixing bacteria can take nitrogen gas and put it into nitrates, and nitrates are a form that plants can use. Okay, so remember, nitrogen-fixing bacteria are the ones that are able to produce nitrogen into nitrates, which are a form that plants can use. Denitrifying bacteria do the opposite. They change nitrates back into nitrogen gas. And if you think back to one of the questions we had on an assignment, it talked about some soil which was very waterlogged, and why this was a problem. Well, the reason it was a problem was because these low oxygen conditions, such as a waterlogged soil, caused denitrifying bacteria to grow, and because they grew, this then enabled them to take the nitrates in the soil and change them into nitrogen gas. The problem with that, again, is that plants need the nitrogen in the form of nitrates, and when it's produced into nitrogen gas, plants can no longer use it. Okay, so again, nitrogen-fixing bacteria change nitrogen gas into nitrates that plants can use. Denitrifying bacteria take nitrates and change it into nitrogen gas. And again, this is in low oxygen conditions. So when we look at the phosphorus cycle, last of all, it's similar to the nitrogen cycle in a certain way. Now, the most common form phosphorus is found on planet Earth is phosphates. The only problem is that phosphates can't be used by living things the way they are. They need to be changed by a process called phosphorylation, and then they're able to enter the food chain. Okay, so we've got a question here. What are some natural and artificial sources of carbon dioxide in the air? So some man-made or artificial sources are fuel from cars and industries. Natural sources, cellular respiration of all living things. Question 13, compare the two types of nitrogen bacteria in terms of A, oxygen requirements, and B, the conversion they carry out. Okay, so remember, denitrifying bacteria are anaerobic. That's another word for low oxygen loving. And again, we saw that waterlogged soils would have denitrifying bacteria, whereas nitrogen-fixing bacteria are aerobic, which means high oxygen. You think about when people do an aerobic workout, they're getting a lot of oxygen into their lungs, or they need to in order to be able to do a lot of running and stuff like that. Sorry, I'm just going to move the phone and I'll be right back. I always forget to do that. Okay, so on to the next page. So this one is asking us about the conversion carried out by each one of these types of bacteria. Again, remember, denitrifying bacteria change nitrates into nitrogen gas, which is a problem for plants. Nitrogen-fixing bacteria do something good for plants. They change nitrogen gas in the atmosphere into nitrates. Question 14, what needs to be done before phosphates can enter the food chain? Again, phosphorylation is a process that allows phosphates to be used by living things. Okay, so we've been looking at some different element cycles. The last kind of cycle we looked at was the water cycle, which also, of course, plays an important part in the lives of living things. If you think about places like Vancouver, they have what are known as moderated climates. And that's because they're close to a large body of water, such as an ocean. So what is a moderated climate? It's one that doesn't get too hot in the summer and doesn't get too cold in the winter. It's pretty comfortable all year round. Now, what causes the moderated climate? Well, because water takes a long time to heat up and a long time to cool down compared to the land, Summer days are cooler and winter days are warmer. And so that's all because of the fact that water has what's called a high heat capacity. In other words, it can hold a lot of heat. All right, so question 15 says, explain how water moderates climate. And the answer is because water has a high heat capacity, carries a lot of heat, it takes a long time to heat up and a long time to cool down. This makes places like Vancouver less hot in the summer and less cool in the winter. Okay, so we looked at this concept of biomes, and we saw that those are large areas of the world that are very similar in terms of the climate they experience and the vegetation that grows in them. So a desert was one example of a biome, a tropical rainforest is another, and tundra is another example of a biome. And so we saw that the tundra biome is actually quite similar to a desert. And why is that? Well, the tundra biome has low amounts of precipitation, so in other words, low amounts of rain and snow, and very few trees. And that's similar to a desert as well. Some additional things about a tundra is that it's very cold, and the ground is permanently frozen, so it's known as permafrost. All right, so as we look at the water cycle here, we can see that water evaporates from surfaces of lakes and rivers. It's known as evaporation. As it rises, it eventually cools, and then it forms either rain or snow. And when it falls into the ground, or to the ground, it's known as precipitation. So plants also play an important role in the water cycle, and the way that works is that as water is drawn up through the roots of plants and then comes out through the leaves, that process is known as transpiration. All right, so question 16, explain how deserts are similar to the tundra. Well, both deserts and the tundra have low precipitation and low amounts of vegetation. They don't have a lot of plants, right? Question 17, how do plants play a role in the water cycle? Well, they lose water through their leaves during the process of transpiration. Okay, now we looked at the theory of evolution, and remember this is just a theory. It was developed by Charles Darwin, and we saw that most people are in agreement with the first part of his theory, which deals with natural selection. But not everyone agrees with the second part of his theory, which says that one species could actually evolve into another species. So some of the steps that were outlined in his theory of natural selection were that, first of all, more creatures are produced that can survive. So we know that to be true, right? And then those creatures which are best adapted to the environment survive. And this is known as survival of the fittest. It's a very common phrase. Darwin believed that new species could be created using these steps over time. Now again, the last step is the one which some people, including myself, would not agree with. I believe that there is adaptation within one species, within a species itself, as creatures adapt to their environments and change as a result. However, I do not believe that organisms have developed into other creatures as a result of evolution. All right, so in evolutionary theory, a new species could develop when a population becomes divided up. So for instance, two groups could be formed on either side of a mountain. One group is not able to pass over to the other side. The theory is that the two sets of creatures which start out the same could become different over time and to develop into a new species. Again, that's Darwin's theory. Their genes would become isolated or different from one another because of the mountains. So physical barriers like mountains or like lakes are believed by evolutionists to lead to isolation of the gene pool. Okay, so those would be things that would cause the genes to be different within a population which started out to be the same. Okay, we're going to look at two different concepts. They're related: migration and influx. So if we talk about creatures leaving an area, this refers to migration, whereas if new creatures are coming into an area, this is called influx. Okay, so question 18 says, describe survival of the fittest. Well, that's when the fittest or best adapted creatures in the environment survive. Question 19 says, explain how physical barriers are believed by evolutionists to lead to speciation. In other words, the development of new species. Well, physical barriers like mountains could separate populations into groups, which could then, according to Darwin, develop into two different species. Question 20 says, compare migration and influx. Okay, so influx, as the name suggests, more creatures are entering into an area, whereas migration, creatures are leaving an area. Okay, so there were actually some early ideas that were proposed by people that had to do with the theory of evolution, which are no longer believed to be true either by evolutionists or creationists. So let's look at a few of these. One of them is called the theory of need, the other is the theory of use and disuse, and the last is the theory of acquired characteristics. Well, the theory of need said that basically if an organism wanted some kind of new organism, or rather new organ to be produced in its body, it could produce it whenever it needed. So it's just kind of like the name suggests. The theory of use and disuse, as the name suggests, means that if the organism no longer needed a certain part, then it would lose it. And it would only develop characteristics if they were useful. But we can see that creatures retain certain things that they have that aren't really that useful to them necessarily, although most things that we have are useful to us. Okay, so the theory of acquired characteristics. Something you acquire is something you gain, for instance, over your lifetime. So all changes that an organism experiences in its lifetime would be passed on to its offspring. Okay, so if it gets stronger muscles, then the idea is that it would acquire those characteristics and pass them on to their offspring. We know that that's not true. So instead, evolutionists came to believe that creatures could not just create new parts because they needed them or didn't need them, the theory of use and disuse, and could not pass on new traits that developed during their lifetime to their offspring, the theory of acquired characteristics. Instead, they believed that new traits came about because of the fact that new creatures who had certain traits who were best adapted to their environment were able to survive. And because those creatures were able to survive, they then passed on their traits to their offspring. So their adaptations were passed on to their offspring. That's the idea. Okay, so one of the initial theories that is no longer believed by any evolutionist or any creationist was proposed by a guy named Lamarck, and he came up with the idea that if a giraffe were to stretch its neck during its lifetime, and its neck were to become longer because, say, the trees were higher, then its longer neck could be passed on to its offspring. But again, that's not believed to be true. So question 21, explain the three theories that are no longer believed to be true in evolution by any evolutionists as well. A, the theory of use and disuse, only parts that were used could be kept. The theory of need, organisms could grow new parts if needed. Theory of acquired characteristics meant that traits acquired during a lifetime could be passed on to offspring. Okay, so what exactly did evolutionists come to believe caused the change that would occur in organisms? Well, the answer is something called mutations. Okay, so what is a mutation again? Well, these are slight changes that occur in the DNA of an organism. And if you think again about DNA as being like a little computer program that's in our cells, so what causes these kind of mutations, these changes? Things like radiation, exposure to radiation. So what evolutionists believed was that mutations or changes in the DNA of an organism could then cause new traits to be produced in that organism, and then those new traits would eventually be selected by the environment if they were positive changes. Now what the problem is that most times when mutations occur in the DNA of an organism, they're actually harmful to an organism. So could mutations really lead to positive changes in an organism? Well, that's a question that needs to be answered. But again, mutations are believed by evolutionists to account for natural selection because mutations occur in DNA or the genes. So this is an attempt to explain how changes or variations could be passed on from parent to child. So one area where evolution's been criticized is the idea of mutations being the method for how variations are passed on from parent to child. Another area where evolution has been criticized by some is the fossil record. So if evolution were true, you would expect that the fossil record would be filled with missing links. Now, these are fossils that are halfway between one type of creature and another. So for example, a half bird, half lizard. However, suggested examples of missing links, examples that are suggested by scientists, are actually very few, and you would expect that there would be lots of them. Okay, so question 22, how do evolutionists believe traits are passed from one creature to another? Well, traits are coded for or programmed by our DNA, in other words, our genes. And these genes can be passed from parent to child. Define mutations. These are slight changes in the DNA of an organism, example as a result of radiation. And question 24 lists two problem areas with the theory of evolution. So one would be missing links exist in the suggested evolution from one creature to another. Another is that mutations are suggested as the means of producing variations in organisms, but they're usually harmful to organisms. I'm sure you guys have heard of the tsunami which affected Japan, and you may well have heard as well about the nuclear reactors that have been damaged as a result of that. And so because of that, you've got radiation leaking out of there, and so of course that could lead to mutations. So they're trying to contain that right now. I'm not sure what they're doing exactly, but the last thing I've heard, they were thinking about putting the whole nuclear reactor in concrete to try to contain the radiation. Okay, now there's a few other words we should go over that relate to the theory of evolution. So an adaptation, remember that's either an inherited trait or a set of traits that improves the chances of survival and reproduction in organisms. So for example, a rabbit having white fur in winter is an adaptation. Now there's a little mini theory of adaptive convergence. That's the theory that two different organisms could become similar in their form and their way of life, even though they're separated by a distance. Convergent evolution means that two unrelated organisms living in the same environment could have similar structures. So again, unrelated organisms with similar structures. Homologous structures are structures which would look different but are believed by some to be creatures who share a common ancestor. So for example, if you look at the bones of a wing and the bones of a hand, some would believe these are homologous structures, again, believed by evolutionists to be from creatures that would have a common ancestor. Whereas another explanation is that God simply used similar building blocks, in other words, similar bone structures, for two different creatures. Okay, analogous structures are similar structures with similar functions on different creatures. So examples of analogous structures would be the wings of birds and wings of bats. Again, similar functions of flying, different creatures. Okay, so we're going to go over those terms that we looked at just now. An adaptation, that's an inherited trait or set of traits that improves the chances of survival and reproduction in an organism. Adaptive convergence, the theory two different organisms could become similar in form and way of life. Convergent evolution, two unrelated organisms living in the same environment having similar structures. Homologous structures, structures that look different but are believed to be from creatures who share a common ancestor, so the bone of a wing and the bones of a hand. Analogous structures, similar structures with similar functions on different creatures. Example, birds of wings, or rather, wings of birds and wings of bats. All right. Now, a guy named Charles Lyell came up with a theory of the geological time scale, in which he divided Earth's history into 4 periods or eras. And again, note that not all people are in agreement on the age of the Earth, so again, this is theoretical. We're going to talk here about the Cenozoic, Mesozoic, and Paleozoic era. So based on this scale, the Cenozoic would be the most recent one, so that would be from 65 million years ago to today. Mesozoic is 240 million years ago to 65 million years ago. And the Paleozoic is 543 million years ago to 240 million years ago. Now, one way of remembering this is that the most recent one has the letter that's, you could say, closest to A in the alphabet, C, and the next one is M, and the last one is P. So you can see that they go from closest to A to closest to Z as you get older and older. Okay. You might have heard of this concept before of radioactive dating. You know, someone will pull out some dinosaur fossil, they'll send it to scientists, and they'll come back and say, you know, this thing is this many millions of years old. Again, there's some disagreement between people on how reliable this method is. I'll actually tell you why there's some disagreement. Because sometimes pressure and heat can actually duplicate the same conditions as long periods of time. So, for example, one time somebody took a rock that was produced when Mount St. Helens erupted back in the 80s. This was a mountain that erupted, volcano that erupted in Washington in the U.S. Somebody took that rock that was produced from that event, sent it to scientists. So that rock was actually, I think, 12 years old or something like that. Somebody sent it to scientists, and apparently it was dated to be millions of years old. Well, why would that be? Well, that would be because, again, pressure and heat can sometimes mimic the conditions of long periods of time. So again, that's why these radioactive dating methods are, you know, there's a little bit of disagreement as to how reliable they are. So some of the radioactive dating methods include carbon dating and uranium dating. So carbon uses a substance called carbon-14, and uranium dating uses a substance known as uranium-238. All right, so question 26 says, what are the time periods for each of these 3 eras? So again, you can see Cenozoic, 65 million years till today. Mesozoic, 240 million to 65 million. Paleozoic, 543 million to 240 million. All right, so question 27. What is radioactive dating? Well, it's a method used to date how old rocks and fossils are, and the substances used are carbon-14, uranium-238. Those are some examples. Okay, we're going to look at a few different special chemicals used by organisms. So we know that creatures in the wild put a lot of energy and effort into attracting a mate so they can reproduce. So a peacock is a good example of that. It has really bright feathers to attract a mate. Also puts on a fancy dance as well for this purpose. Now as well, animals produce certain chemicals known as pheromones, and those chemicals make them more attractive to the opposite sex. Aside from playing an important part in reproduction, chemicals have other important uses for plants and animals as well. For example, enzymes are special chemicals that speed up chemical reactions in animals. Now, amylase is a type of enzyme found in your mouth which breaks down starch in foods. Okay, so question 28 says, give the purpose of enzymes and pheromones. Well, again, enzymes speed up chemical reactions, whereas pheromones are chemicals which would help a mate attract another mate of the opposite sex. All right, so we're going to look shift gears here a little bit and look at the different parts of a lake. And there's a lot of different words labeled here, but we're going to just focus on a few. The littoral zone is the shallow part of a lake, and the benthic zone is the deep part of the lake. It's known as the benthic zone or the benthos. As you can imagine, there's a lot of plants that can grow here because the light can penetrate, whereas the light cannot penetrate the deeper parts of the lake. We also talked earlier about a process called eutrophication, and that's when a lake can actually become filled up with organic matter or silt over time. Okay, so the organic matter is broken down and it causes the lake to be filled up. We also looked, when we were looking at bodies of water, we looked at rivers, and we saw the location where a river enters an ocean is called an estuary. Okay, so we're going to define some of these words we just looked at. The littoral zone is the shallow part of a lake. The benthos is the deepest part of a lake. Eutrophication is the filling in of a lake with organic matter. And an estuary was the part, or rather the place where a river meets an ocean. All right, so guys, thanks for hanging with us and watching the whole thing. And again, I really want to encourage you to practice all these blue questions after you've watched the recording. If you can practice them and get them all on your own, you should do well in the test. Again, remember, it's really important to do well in the midterm because it's worth the most of anything we've had so far this year. Again, the midterm will be on April the 14th. I want to wish you guys an awesome spring break. Please feel free to share what you guys did on spring break. Other than that, have a great day. Talk to you later, and God bless. Bye for now.